Equality and its immoral limits, Part 2, as featured in Belonging Again. Section 6. Though perhaps idealistic, the most antifragile way to overcome immorality and injustice isn't through outlawing them, but allowing individuals to dynamically and freely change their behavior on their own. Where this is not done and law is instead employed, people might not be internally changed, and in fact the legal action could make people more bigoted. Not necessarily, since law teaches, but law might teach people that the state is delegitimate. Hard to say. However, where law isn't employed, citizens can unambiguously prove to one another that they refuse intolerance and immoral discrimination, not because they are afraid of the law, but because they truly believe in justice. In a world where people were free to be unjust and there was no injustice, we'd have strong reason to believe injustice was declining. While in a world where injustice was illegal, we'd be unsure. There would be anxiety. Of course, in a world where injustice was illegal, there would be truly humble and moral people, but the issue is that people would struggle to know with confidence that these individuals were truly against injustice. There would always be the possibility that they only acted as such because of the law. The individual could only prove themselves if the laws were removed. But who could remove the laws without being seen as supporting immorality and injustice? Hypothetically, if it was illegal for people to tell one another, "I hate you," then if people never said this to us, there would be uncertainty regarding if people never said this because they really didn't hate us, or if they didn't say this because they feared breaking the law. Yes, the law would reduce the amount of times people said, "I hate you" to one another, but it would not necessarily reduce the worry that I am hated. In fact, it could make people start doubting if they were really loved by the people who never said, "I hate you," precisely because there would always be the ambiguity regarding the reason for the lack of the statement. In this way, law can create ambiguity, but then again, it is also the case that a society without law devolves into turmoil. Where it is illegal to say "I hate you," it is not clear if statements of hate lessen because people have chosen to stop being hateful, which means we cannot become less sure of what's really going on inside the head of others, causing meta-mentality, as discussed earlier in Belonging Again. Sure, people don't say to us "I hate you," but they might want to and only can't because of the law. Uncertainty and anxiety can grow, and in this way law can increase fragility, all while also perhaps teaching people to be fragile in themselves, seeing as law teaches, as Robert George notes. On this point, Baudrillard, author of Simulacry and Simulation, admonished that our age was one where the fake and the real had mixed like milk and dye, so much so that it was impossible now for us to even say there was ever such thing as the real to dye. There was only ever the mixture. I agree with Baudrillard, which I think entails implications of societies trying to recognize and stop injustice, while also not worsening existential anxiety. For Baudrillard, it is not given where reality starts and ends, and so we cannot say it starts anywhere. We seem stuck in a copy without an original. And likewise, without societal givens, we cannot easily say where we act justly and where we act immorally. We're all immoral with the I am in parentheses. Indeed, we arguably always have been this, but having to face this reality and learning to live with the ambiguity is very challenging. If the majority cannot handle this tension, pluralism seems destined to fail. A concern about internal immorality can be overcome when people feel that others genuinely and or really accept those of whom were once mistreated. But if today the real is dead, and there are less widely shared givens, there might not be a real or agreed-upon standard against which we can determine if people are no longer immoral. A grave challenge explored in both collective consciousness and trust and scripted, which also suggests concerning epistemology if the loss of givens in reality lead to anxiety and fear. The death of the real generates existential uncertainty, and where societal givens are gone and or dynamic processes of falsification are limited, it is not given what constitutes reality. In line with the thought of Karl Popper, it cannot be truly falsified if a person is unjust or not, as it cannot be verified if a person isn't unjust. For example, a bigot could pretend to not be a bigot, as someone who isn't a bigot could pretend to be a bigot. But where there is a test, a sense of reality can better be confidently approached. In an age when the real is dead, it seems especially necessary to exercise such a test, and though it won't work perfectly, it could at least provide a way to try to separate the milk and dye. However, are there any guarantees such a test will work? Not at all. Especially not if people reason according to AA versus AB, fail to be absolute knowers, implement dominant strategies in conversation. A dynamic system is only a space in which improvement might occur. But that is a topic which requires more elaboration. All of belonging again, part 2, arguably. Anyway, if a process of laws against injustice calls people to become more unjust in reaction against the ambiguity, then arguably the laws meant to stop injustice are themselves unjust. This is a strange paradox, but if we are to take seriously this possibility, we may support laws on grounds of intention versus outcome. Furthermore, if laws are passed to end injustice, which teach people to act unjustly, then even if those laws are removed, people might be trained into habits that will not easily break. Truly passing law should be taken with great seriousness. If a law is passed that suggests no one should be baptized before 18, and Christians come to believe the state should be opposed and destroyed, which could cause horrors and injustices across the nation, then even if the state removes the law, it might take Christians a decade before they trust the state again. During that time, the social order could be more fragile. Considering this, it might be nice to believe that we should never pass laws and remove them entirely. Existential ambiguity would be removed, but we might only be existentially certain that the social order was awful. All laws or all free exchange are not answers to our troubles, which means society should be dialectical, AB, which is very difficult. Further complicating our problem, if the state makes it illegal not to do something unjust, the government can at the same time transform the meaning of doing something just. This is similar to how money can transform the way people engage with certain activities, as argued in What Money Can Buy by Michael Sandel. For example, it has been found that if you ask people not to be late to pick up their children, they will do the best to arrive on time, but if you impose a fine for being late, they actually will be late more often, simply viewing the situation in terms of money and not in terms of morality. When it comes to making illegal a certain injustice, the risk is that something similar occurs. Acting justly becomes a legal matter, not a moral matter, and so people can doubt that those around them have undergone a moral change. This can generate anxiety and distrust, and as argued in On Trust by O.G. Rose, society without trust seems doomed. Habits will then develop in which people get used to living without trust, and habits are hard to break. Arguably, a culture is most fundamentally its habits, which brings to mind something Charles Dewing wrote. Movements don't emerge because everyone suddenly decides to face the same direction at once. They rely on social patterns that begin as the habits of friendship, grow through the habits of communities, and are situated by new habits that change participants' sense of self. Section 7. An important element of freedom is for people to be able to define, realize morality, and hence to define the limits of equality, which means that a part of freedom is something incredibly risky. As long as people are not harming others, the people should generally be left alone to define things how they will. Within a notion of the good, everyone is expanded at equality, so it is easy to forget that the parameters of equality are where morality stops and immorality begins. This limit exists both on an individual and a societal level. For individuals, free exchange is the dynamic process in which people can define the non-fixed limit for themselves. On the societal level, through laws, the limit must be fixed upon where individual liberty is maximized, which unfortunately is not self-evident. Humans are imperfect, so where this optimal point lies is not easy to determine. Therefore, there must be a process in which laws can be changed and moved. That said, laws are to remain more fixed and fluid, because individuals, incredibly fluid, need that rigidity to avoid spiraling off into alienating chaos. And yet, at the same time, these laws must provide a framework that contains the fluid and more chaotic process of free exchange, which will easily resent the legal framework and try to break it down. A tense and difficult paradox. People are dynamic and require a dynamic system in which to flourish. And what can violate human rights is that which does not uphold the framework in which humans can define for themselves what constitutes human rights and the good life. A strange paradox, AB. Yes, force seems quicker and necessary when faced with an emergency, but force entails its own risks. If it is urgent that one reaches the bottom of a cliff, though jumping is quicker, the long way can still be the only way. Still, we would be foolish not to acknowledge some problems and risks involved with relying on an emergent and dynamic system to generate metaphysical values which stabilize us, and indeed history is a story of these risks. Definition begets oppression. There is indeed active oppression, but there is also institutional oppression that causes harm, though this might incubate and teach more direct oppression. However, institutional oppression is what occurs against murderers, which is an accepted practice. So what institutional oppression should be established and which shouldn't? Again, a dynamic process is needed where ideas and premises arise and can be tested by countless individuals billions of times over in countless different ways and in countless different scenarios. Free exchange through time seems to be a society's best way to manage the problem of uncertainty, and as science overcomes existential anxiety through repetition, testing, and falsification, so free exchange can do the same. Unfortunately, the effectiveness of free exchange involving metaphysics is likely less versus when concerned with more physical subjects, as we will explore. Again, we do not think of ourselves as oppressors for imprisoning murderers. Not all oppression is necessarily immoral, but not all oppression is moral either. Throughout history, there have been plenty of groups which have been immorally denied equality, and though their oppressors had a morality that did not make them oppressors, the oppressors were still immoral. But how does a society go about deciding which oppression is moral and which oppression is immoral? A philosophical revolution is an option, but in which environment are philosophical revolutions best incubated? Free exchange seems to be the best environment. But can't bad ideas also emergently and organically arise? Indeed, they can. We should not assume emergence will save us. Perhaps it is much more likely that free exchange economically and technologically brings about more good emergence than bad, precisely because these products and outcomes can be more readily tested against the facticity of the world. If someone invents a new coffee maker, we can test it in the context of our morning routine to see if it improves the experience. The meaning of facticity is certainly a matter of interpretation, but the facticity itself is a more object-based and shared across subjects, and so emergences, which can be tested in and according to facticity, is much more likely to be more good than bad, generally because people must hold good motivations and must be motivated to improve their daily lives. This isn't to say technologies and economic outcomes must be good, but it is to say they are easier to test and compare across millions of people. However, metaphysical emergences like values and worldviews are far harder to test, and so the probability that metaphysical emergences are bad is higher than more physical emergences. This isn't to say they cannot be tested at all, but it's easier to find tribes of people who share X metaphysical value, which say emerged in the 1980s with a new interpretation of Revelation, which, though opposed by people outside that group, those in that group themselves don't readily have experience which force them to deconstruct X metaphysical value, and so they can produce and protect X value through isolationism. If I'm trying to determine if a coffee pot works, facticity itself applies to a small group just as much as it does a large group or a lone individual, and though there will be variations of judgment, the point is that isolationism and confirmation bias isn't so much at play. For all these reasons, the likelihood that bad metaphysical emergences arise is higher than more physical emergences. I stress, though, bad technological emergences are possible, as could occur with the singularity, though we'll see. It is likely meaningless to tell oppressors that they oppress, for they likely hold a morality in which they do nothing wrong, defining those they oppress as either immoral or inhuman. We can either beat them in the arena of free exchange or turn to the state, with our minds naturally favoring the directness of the state. Though the effectiveness of free exchange working in metaphysical areas is less than in more physical matters which can be tested against facticity. However, no emergent result is necessarily for the best, but we also cannot say such as a result. We also cannot say such a result is for the worse. Ultimately, no one can say for sure which is the case, but upon the basis of the billions of decisions of free exchange, we at least have a justified reason to believe that the conclusions that arise from this dynamic decision-making process are more likely best, and yet we cannot be certain of this, thus meaning there is always some space to oppose free exchange. Section 8. Where there is no equality, there is no discrimination, which is to say there is no need for discrimination to justify injustice in a nation that doesn't believe people should be treated equally. Thus, we cannot assume that an absence of discrimination is an absence of injustice, but likewise, we cannot assume that a presence of discrimination isn't seen as discrimination because of a background of justice. Moral shortcomings could be evidence of moral evolution, though there is danger in such a thought causing complacency. This being the case, a system of free exchange can prove useful to help us better assess what's what with more confidence, seeing as it is not evident if injustice is only such thanks to assumptions of justice, or if a sense of justice is only thanks to an inability to identify injustice. It's all mixed and unclear, and it can be tempting when faced with this ambiguity to use law to sort it all out. But unfortunately, law generates its own ambiguity. We are partly equal in that everyone can give up their equality through free acts. It suggests the necessity of both a legal framework and system of free exchange. If we only had free exchange, it would not be possible for me to do something against the law which calls me to voluntarily surrender my equality. And in such a circumstance, equality would be meaningless and not really a right, but more so the state of things. All would be equal in anarchy. However, if we only had legality and were all equal under the absolute law, this equality would likely not be good to us and would rather feel oppressive and a source of misery. For us to feel free and for that freedom to be good, we require a mixture of free exchange and law, but that means we must manage an unstable state. Where there is instability, there is anxiety, and if we need instability, that means we need anxiety, strangely enough. We cannot escape existential anxiety and uncertainty entirely, and shouldn't want to. The question is only if we will primarily face it individually or collectively. Freedom is existentially difficult for individuals, hence why we can want to escape from freedom, just like Eric Fromm discussed, and yet free exchange can generate more existentially stable outcomes for people. Law, on the other hand, can free individuals of existential anxiety, but law can create overall results for the collective which feel more fragile and are more prone to cause existential anxiety. Hence, it seems we have to choose between facing anxiety on the onset for a long-term stability or avoid anxiety and our immediacy at the cost of long-term instability. At the same time, if there are no givens, the amount of and severity of the anxiety and uncertainty which individuals must face in free exchange might simply prove too much to handle for the average person to resist the temptation of overfitting law to bring about stability. Furthermore, it's not self-evident what even constitutes overfitting law, and so it can easily seem responsible and a rational course of action to extend and apply law when faced with a society where givens have been deconstructed. The severity of the anxiety certainly makes it feel rational, after all. Are we saying the state is always in the wrong? Not at all. In India, there was once a practice where if a husband died, his wife would throw herself upon the funeral pyre and burn to death. She was often pressured by the community to do this, and practically had no choice on the matter. Wasn't it right for the state to outlaw this practice so that this social pressure would abate? Yes, for it appears to be a violation of self-ownership, but a dynamic system would be needed to tell and to change the hearts of the people from wanting to do the practice at all. Government is necessary, for without it there can be no free exchange, only chaos. However, with too much of it, free exchange won't work. And ultimately, who cares for existential stability if it requires the sacrifice of women on funeral pyres? This is basically a sacrificial ritual for our own stability, is it not? Indeed, to keep such a circumstance from arising, the state must be present, but that means we are always in danger. We must discern each situation and balance between free exchange and the state issue by issue, but that will require great intellectual and mental work, and we are likely to become tired with time. Tired, we might find ourselves tempted to fold. Section 9. With each worldview, system of givens, ideology, and so forth, there is a different sense of what constitutes ethics, and thus a different sense of how and to whom equality should be extended. To keep these differences from making society unlivable, a framework of law is established that provides shared rules across worldviews, and though no doubt many of the rules will be opposed and disliked, the state seeks to establish laws which people can live with, and if they fail, the society could devolve into anarchy. If the state succeeds, society is possible. The less diversity and pluralism, the easier it is for the state to find a sweet spot between law and free exchange, which is to say a space in which people can decide their views for themselves. When a society is divided between Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians, it's easier to create laws that don't feel like they are overreaching to people, versus when the society is divided between Christianity, Muslims, Hindus, and the like. The greater the variation in first principles and fundamental beliefs, the more difficult it is for the state to strike a balance between law and free exchange, which makes free exchange possible without at the same time allowing immorality, injustice, and so forth to spread. As pluralism intensifies, this challenge will only prove harder. Seeing as values are relative to first principles, it will not work simply to tell people to support equality or support freedom to fix our social ills. It will seem self-evident to us that these values mean, as it will seem self-evident that people are immoral not to support our positions, but in fact our notions of equality and freedom are necessarily situated within the terms of our first principles, and unless we support anarchism, everyone limits to whom they extend equality relative to how they define immorality. Thus, other people limit their extension of equality just like us, and though they draw the line in a place we think is immoral, we too still draw a line. If we tell people not to draw lines, we will prove hypocritical. We would instead need to enter into their worldview, ideology, or the like, and make a case for the line to not be drawn at Y point, but instead Z point. But even if we succeed at this effort in one area, we could succeed in all areas across. Could we succeed in all areas across all worldviews, or is this practically impossible? If so, then it makes sense to turn to law to more bluntly bring about the change we want to see. That perhaps should come about, but unfortunately increases in law can threaten free exchange, causing ineffectiveness and anxiety, and risk totalitarianism. Entering systems of thought and working on them from the inside seems to be our only hope, but do people even listen to reason? Perhaps, perhaps not. The limits of equality are determined by morality, necessary limits which are determined and tested by the dynamic process of free exchange. Violations of this process are always risky, even when best, and they generate ambiguity and existential anxiety. Where there is only law, society suffers under totalitarianism, but where there is only free exchange, society also suffers because freedom becomes chaotic, undesirable, and thus irrational. Again, a sweet spot must be found, but as givens dissolve precisely because of the forces of pluralism, then the chaotic feeling of free exchange will grow, and faced with that anxiety, people will likely atomize, become reactive, and the like. To fix these problems and all the others explored in Belonging Again, it would seem logical to turn to law, seeing as law can so effectively unify people into shared rules and hence shared intelligibility. Unfortunately, top-down methods of regaining shared intelligibility are not as effective as shared intelligibility gained emergently, organically, and through givens, because law creates ambiguity. Approaching the close of this paper with this point, we can also approach the main point I want to make that fits into the overall arc of Belonging Again. Laws generate existential anxiety, and so it is unlikely that law can replace givens and address our concerns. This applies to the state as a whole, which means givens are primarily a matter of culture. Culture and state blur and mix in profound ways, but they are not identical, and we cannot accomplish through the state what can only be accomplished through culture. Law teaches, though, and so law forms culture, but it also forms us to believe law is culture and can do the work of culture, which is perhaps true to a degree, but when it comes to mitigating existential anxiety so that we avoid totalitarianism, law cannot solve the issue, because law generates uncertainty in itself. And this is the rub. Law creates ambiguity, even law which helps. Thus, if ambiguity is our main problem, even law which helps will not likely help as is most needed. If there was an absolute ground which unified all people, some undeniable and non-contingent truth, as perhaps sought by analytical philosophy before Kurt Gödel, the dilemma of balancing free exchange and law could perhaps be solved and finished. But as Derrida shows, despite philosophy's obsession with finding it, there is no such ground of universal experience. Rather, there are many grounds of experience, as there are many rule books for different games. Because this is the case, free exchange is needed to determine which subjective ideas of common grounds are most likely most actual. Without such a process, we can never know if our ideas of possible actuality are legitimate or empty. Even if we possess a legitimate ground without a process of testing, we likely can never feel confident such is the case. Likewise, there is no absolute identity, absolute interpretation, absolute lifestyle, so forth. If anything, there is an absolute need for free exchange, it seems, by which we can test and develop our ways of life. Laws can create existential uncertainty, which is where there might be freedom, but people won't feel free. At the same time, though, law which is unstable or ever-changing can also cause existential uncertainty, for people won't be sure what constitutes the rules and will feel more governed by men than law. And where there is no law, people may be free, but they may never feel secure and safe, rendering their freedom meaningless. And this is our plight. Given a problem, it might be tempting to want to believe an absolute ground was possible, for then we could tell ourselves that the tension between law and free exchange could be balanced and overcome. Where that ground cannot be found, though, we must instead learn skills and art forms for managing pluralism, which means there is no possibility of a final resting place in which we could rather find a solution. The lesson curse of postmodernism was coming to realize and accept the impossibility of such a solution. We must work, and we must keep working, though perhaps this is optimal, seeing as it means we never have to be bored. Law creates existential stability and hinders free exchange. But if it didn't, it might be possible to deal with the problems explored in the essay Belonging Again through law, which is to say we might try re-establishing and recreating lost givens through the state. But this will not work. Law cannot replace givens without causing totalitarianism and erasing diversity. Law is needed for a framework, but it will not solve our current paradox, which lies in free exchange and how people relate. Culture must be focused on, which ultimately might mean we focus upon subjects in the great mystery of people themselves. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Instagram, Anchor, YouTube. For the complete Belonging Again playlist, please find it on YouTube, and a list of all the entries can be found on Medium. And thank you so much for your time.